I didn't say a word when they handed me the eviction notice. The paper slid across the polished conference table like it had already won. Heavy cream stock. Official county seal stamped in blue ink. The kind of document that's supposed to make people nervous. Across from me, 3 members of the Willowbrook Estates HOA board watched closely, their faces tight with the smug patience of people who believe the outcome has already been decided. I picked up the notice slowly. Vacate property within 30 days, it read. Land officially transferred under adverse possession ruling. 30 days. 47 acres of land that had been in my family for almost 70 years, gone in 30 days. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten lawsuits or demand explanations. Instead, I reached into the worn leather folder sitting beside me and slid a single document across the table. It stopped right in front of Maggie Thornwell. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then she leaned forward slightly, adjusting the pearl bracelet on her wrist, her manicured fingernail tapping the edge of the page. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked with a polite little smile. The kind of smile people use when they're humoring someone who's already lost. "Just something you might want to read," I said. Maggie barely glanced down at the page. Then she froze. Her smile didn't disappear right away. It sort of cracked, like glass under pressure. The title at the top of the document was printed in faded black type. Willow Creek Watershed, Senior Water Rights Deed, 1923. Her eyes moved across the page again, slower this time. And for the first time since I'd walked into that room, the confidence around the table shifted. Rick Thornwell leaned forward. "Maggie." She didn't answer. I stood up. Outside the window behind them, the Texas morning sun was climbing over the hills that used to be pasture land. Used to be. Now they were covered in freshly built houses. 35 of them. Identical gray roofs, perfect green lawns, white fences, luxury SUVs parked neatly in driveways. Willowbrook Estates, a place that didn't even exist 18 months ago. 35 houses built directly downstream from a dam my grandfather had constructed in 1978, a dam that had been quietly holding back 3 million gallons of water, and a dam that, until that morning, nobody in that room had bothered to ask about. "You should probably read the second page," I said. Maggie flipped it over slowly. Her husband Rick finally grabbed the document from her hands and started scanning the text himself. "Jake," he said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to prove with this?" I looked out the window again. The water in Pop's reservoir glittered in the distance beyond the hills. Calm, still, waiting. "Just clearing something up," I said. "That land you built your subdivision on?" Rick crossed his arms. "Yes. It isn't just land." He frowned slightly. "Then what is it?" I met his eyes. "It's part of the Willow Creek watershed system." Silence filled the room. Then Maggie laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a confident one. "Oh, honey," she said, leaning back in her chair. "We had the entire development approved by the county." "I'm sure you did. Our engineers ran every environmental assessment required by the state." "I'm sure they did that too." She spread her hands, smiling wider now. "So I'm not really sure what you think this little antique document changes." I nodded slowly. "That's fair." Then I opened my folder again and slid one more paper across the table. This one had a different header. *US, Army Corps of Engineers, Flood Control Structure Permit, Astapel. Rick picked it up immediately. His expression shifted as he read. "What is this?" "That," I said calmly, "is the original federal permit for the dam on my property." Maggie waved a hand dismissively. "So you have a pond?" I shook my head. "No." Rick kept reading. And suddenly the color drained from his face. "It's not a pond," he muttered. Maggie turned toward him. "Rick, He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lowered the document back onto the table. "What?" she snapped. He swallowed. "It's a regulated flood control structure." The room went quiet again. I could almost hear the gears turning inside Maggie's head. Then she shook it off. "Even if that's true," she said sharply, "it doesn't change the fact that this property legally belongs to Willowbrook Estates now." I nodded again. "You might want to double-check that." Rick flipped back to the water rights deed. His eyes moved across one specific paragraph. Then he looked up at me. "You're bluffing." I smiled. "Am I?" He stood up, abruptly. I smiled. "Am I?" "You can't just—" But I was already heading for the door. Behind me, Maggie's voice rose. "Where do you think you're going?" I paused at the doorway and looked back at them. "You should probably check the weather forecast," I said. Rick frowned. "Why?" "Storm's coming tonight," Maggie scoffed. "So?" I shrugged. "Nothing." Then I added one more thing. "Except the spillway gates open automatically when the reservoir hits capacity." The silence that followed was almost beautiful. Rick stared at me. You're not seriously suggesting?" I pushed the door open. "Oh," I said casually, "I'm not suggesting anything." Outside, the morning air smelled like rain. Dark clouds were already gathering on the horizon. Back in the conference room, 35 brand new homes sat peacefully downstream. Perfect lawns, fresh paint, built directly across the original path of Willow Creek. And for the first time in 45 years, that creek was about to start flowing again. My grandfather used to say that land remembers, not people, not fences, not paperwork filed in some courthouse. Land remembers water. I didn't understand what he meant the first time he told me that. I was 9 years old, standing beside him on the old wooden bridge that crossed Willow Creek, kicking pebbles into the slow brown current while he leaned on the railing with a thermos of black coffee in his hand. Back then, the creek ran wide and lazy through the valley, cutting a silver path through 47 acres of pasture, oak trees, and tall summer grass. In the mornings, the mist would sit low over the water like a blanket, and deer would step carefully out of the tree line to drink. Pop would always arrive before sunrise. Didn't matter if it was July heat or January frost. He'd be out there in the same faded denim jacket, walking the property line like he was greeting an old friend. "This land feeds us," he told me once, crouching down to scoop up a handful of damp soil. "But water's what keeps it alive." Then he pointed upstream. About half a mile into the hills, the creek narrowed into a rocky channel where the ground dipped sharply between two ridges. That's where he built the dam. I remember watching the construction like it was the most important thing in the world. I must have been 12 that summer. The entire valley echoed with the rumble of rented bulldozers and dump trucks hauling gravel down the dirt road. The air smelled like diesel fuel and fresh-cut cedar. Pop supervised everything personally. He had a rolled-up blueprint in his back pocket the entire time, even though the paper was so worn by the end of the project that the edges had started to tear. "Why are you building it so big?" I asked him once as we stood on the ridge overlooking the half-finished structure. The dam was massive compared to what I'd expected. 30 feet high, reinforced concrete spillway gates, steel control wheels mounted on thick metal posts. It looked more like something you'd see at a reservoir than on a family ranch. Pop wiped sweat off his forehead and squinted toward the creek bed. "Because water doesn't ask permission," he said. At the time, that sounded like one of those strange things old men say when they don't feel like explaining something to a kid. Years later, I realized he wasn't being mysterious. He was being practical. Willow Creek wasn't always gentle. Most of the year it drifted along quietly through the valley, shallow enough to step across in places. But every few years, a storm would roll down from the hills and dump days of rain across the watershed. And when that happened, the creek turned violent. Pop had seen it happen twice before he built the dam. The first flood came in 1962. It washed out 2 county bridges and turned half the lower valley into a swamp for weeks. The second one nearly took out our farmhouse. So when Pop finally had enough savings and county approval, he built something that could control it, not stop it, just guide it. The reservoir behind the dam stretched across nearly 15 acres when it filled completely. Most days it sat calm and quiet, reflecting the sky like a sheet of dark glass. Pop stocked it with bass and catfish the year after construction finished. By the time I turned 16, that reservoir had become my entire world. Summer afternoons meant fishing off the old double, Odin Dock, while dragonflies skimmed the water. Winter mornings meant breaking thin sheets of ice near the shoreline just to hear them crack. My father used the lower pasture for cattle. My mother planted a small orchard near the house. And every spring the creek flooded the far meadow just enough to leave behind rich soil that grew grass taller than your waist. The land took care of us, not in some poetic way. In a practical one, groceries came from the cattle we raised. College tuition came from the hay we sold each fall. Repairs on the farmhouse came from fishing tournaments held on the reservoir. Everything tied back to the same thing: water moving through land exactly the way it had for hundreds of years. And Pop passed away when I was 26. Heart attack, quick and quiet, just like he would have wanted. A week after the funeral, I found his old blueprint tube sitting in the barn loft. Inside were the original construction plans for the dam. I unrolled them on the kitchen table that night while rain tapped against the windows. Every measurement was written in careful pencil: spillway height, watershed flow calculations. There were also copies of federal permits folded neatly into the back of the tube. Army Corps of Engineers approval, county floodplain authorization, and something else. A document older than anything else in the pile, a water rights deed dated 1923. Back then, I barely glanced at it. To me, it was just another piece of paperwork Pop had kept for record keeping. The farm kept running the same way for years after he was gone. Quiet mornings, long summers, creek water flowing slow through the valley. Nothing much changed, until the surveyors showed up. At first it was just a few men walking along the property line with bright orange stakes and laser tripods. Then the trucks started arriving. Bulldozers, with excavators, concrete mixers. Within 6 months, the lower half of the valley had turned into a construction site. 35 houses went up faster than I thought was possible. Rows of identical foundations rising from land that used to flood every spring. I drove down there one afternoon while they were framing the third row of homes. A man in a reflective vest stopped me at the dirt entrance road. "Private development," he said. I looked past him at the houses stretching across the valley floor. "You know this land floods, right?" He shrugged. "Not according to the plans." That was the first time I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because the plans he was talking about clearly hadn't come from my grandfather. The first time I met Maggie Thornwell, she arrived in a white SUV that cost more than my first 3 pickup trucks combined. It rolled slowly down the gravel road toward my farmhouse, tires crunching over stones that had been there longer than she'd probably lived in the entire state. I was repairing the fence along the south pasture when I saw the vehicle stop near the old gate. 3 people stepped out, 2 men in business suits and Maggie. You could tell immediately who was in charge. She walked ahead of the others with the kind of confidence that comes from being used to people stepping aside. Perfect hair, expensive sunglasses, and heels that had absolutely no business touching ranch dirt. I leaned against the fence post and waited. When she reached the gate, she didn't open it. Instead, she looked around the valley slowly, like someone inspecting property they were thinking about buying. Then she finally noticed me. "You must be Jake," she said. Not a question. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. "That depends who's asking." She smiled politely and removed her sunglasses. Maggie Thornwell, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Behind her, one of the men handed me a business card. The card was thick and glossy. It listed Maggie as HOA Board President and Community Development Director. I glanced past them toward the valley floor, where bulldozers were already moving dirt. "What can I help you with?" I asked. Maggie clasped her hands together like we were about to discuss landscaping options. "Well," she said cheerfully, "we're just trying to get to know our neighbors." Neighbors. That word sat strangely in the air. 18 months earlier, the only neighbors I had within 2 miles were cattle and coyotes. Now there were dozens of construction workers hammering away at houses that had appeared almost overnight. "Is that right?" I said. She nodded enthusiastically. "We're building a beautiful residential community down there. 35 homes, walking trails, community park, private clubhouse." She turned and gestured toward the construction site like she was unveiling a luxury resort. I followed her hand. What used to be open pasture was now carved into streets and rectangular lots. Wooden frames of half-built houses stood in rows like skeletons waiting for skin. Bulldozers pushed dirt into neat piles, where spring floods used to spread across the meadow. "You know that land floods," I said. One of the men behind her chuckled softly. Maggie smiled, the same smile she'd probably practiced in front of a mirror 1,000 times. "Oh, we've had engineers look at everything," she said. "Perfectly safe." I studied her for a moment. Engineers who have actually seen this creek in the spring. Her smile didn't move. Our development plans were fully approved by the county, which meant no. She hadn't seen it. None of them had. They had looked at maps, reports, maybe a satellite image or two, but they had never stood in the T-Valley during a 3-day storm while Willow Creek turned brown and angry and filled the entire floodplain like a river twice its normal size. I pointed toward the hills. "You see that dam up there?" Maggie glanced briefly in the direction I indicated. "Yes, we noticed that little pond." Little pond. That was the first moment I realized exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. "That little pond holds back a lot of water," I said. One of the suited men stepped forward and adjusted his tie. "Our hydrology consultants reviewed the area," he said. "The structure appears to be privately owned and non-regulated." I almost laughed. Non-regulated. My grandfather had spent 2 years dealing with federal engineers before they approved the thing. But clearly whoever these people had hired never bothered checking federal permits. Maggie waved her hand dismissively. "In any case, we're here about something else." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thin envelope. "Property boundaries," she said. I didn't take the envelope. "What about them?" She opened it herself and pulled out a folded map. The paper showed the entire valley, divided into bright-colored parcels. Most of it was labeled Willowbrook Estates Development Area, but one section caught my eye. A long strip of land along the creek. My land. According to the map, the boundary line cut directly through the lower pasture and included almost 12 acres that had always belonged to my family. "That line's wrong," I said. Maggie tilted her head slightly. "Our surveyors are extremely thorough. My grandfather bought this property in 1957. I said, "I've got the deeds." She gave a sympathetic little smile. "Yes, we're aware there may be some confusion regarding historical usage." Confusion. That word was doing a lot of work. I looked at the map again. The 11 acres they had marked weren't random. They were the lowest part of the valley, the floodplain. Exactly where Willow Creek spread out during heavy storms. "You're planning to build houses there," I said. "Premium waterfront lots." I stared at her for a long moment. Then I said the only thing that made sense. "You people really didn't do your homework." One of the men behind her laughed under his breath. Maggie's smile tightened slightly. "I assure you," she said, Our legal team has reviewed every inch of this project. I nodded slowly. Then they must have missed something. She crossed her arms now. And what would that be? I looked past her again toward the houses, rising across the valley floor. Rows and rows of fresh foundations poured directly into soil that had been underwater more times than I could count growing up. And suddenly, I understood something important. These people weren't cautious developers. They were gamblers. They had looked at cheap land, rushed through approvals, and assumed no one around here knew enough to stop them. Maggie waited for me to answer. I just shrugged. Guess we'll find out. Her expression hardened for the first time. You should review that map carefully, she said, folding it back into the envelope, because according to county records, she paused. Part of your land may already belong to us. Then she turned and walked back toward her SUV, heels sinking slightly into the gravel with each step. The two men followed. The engine started. Dust rose behind the tires as they drove away. I stood there watching the valley for a long time after they disappeared down the road. 35 houses, right in the middle of a floodplain. And upstream from them, 3 million gallons of water sitting quietly behind a dam they thought was just a pond. The first clue that something as wrong didn't come from a lawyer. It came from a storm. 3 weeks after Maggie Thornwell showed up at my gate, with her glossy maps and confident smile, the valley got its first real rain of the season. Not a thunderstorm that rolls through in an hour, but the slow, steady kind that starts before dawn and keeps falling all day. By noon, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete. Rain hammered the tin roof of the barn, while the creek behind the pasture began to rise. I stood under the porch, watching the water move through the valley the way it always had, spreading across the low meadow like a long breath the land had been holding in far. It was nothing unusual. In fact, it was exactly what Willow Creek had done every few years since before my grandfather bought the property. But down in the new subdivision, things looked very different. Fresh sod lawns had already turned into muddy patches. Construction crews were scrambling to move equipment out of shallow pools, forming between the half-built houses. A yellow excavator sat tilted slightly, where the ground had softened beneath it, and the creek hadn't even reached its peak yet. That afternoon I drove down the hill and parked on the edge of what they were calling Willowbrook Boulevard. The road was brand new, smooth black asphalt with bright painted lines that still smelled like tar. Water was already running across it. A construction supervisor in a hard hat was yelling at workers trying to clear a drainage pipe clogged with mud. You guys said this thing drained downhill, he shouted. One of the workers shrugged. It does. He pointed toward the creek, which was now several feet wider than it had been that morning. I didn't say anything. I just watched. The water wasn't rushing violently yet. It was doing something slower and more dangerous, spreading, filling the low parts of the valley exactly the way it always had. Exactly the way anyone who had lived here longer than 5 minutes would know it did. A man in a reflective vest finally noticed my truck and walked over. You live up there? He asked, pointing toward the ridge where my house sat. Yeah. He wiped rain off his helmet. Did it always flood like this? I looked around at the water creeping across their construction site. Then I said the truth. This isn't flooding. He frowned. What do you mean? This is normal. That answer didn't make him feel better. By evening, the rain had slowed, but the damage was already obvious. Pools of water filled the foundations of several houses. The lowest street in the development looked like a shallow canal. I drove back up the hill with a feeling I couldn't quite explain. Something about the entire situation felt careless, like someone had built a house without checking if the ground underneath it was solid. That night, I pulled the old blueprint tube out of the barn loft again. The same one my grandfather had kept for decades. Inside were the dam plans I'd looked at years earlier after he passed away. The paper still smelled faintly like dust and engine oil. I spread everything across the kitchen table. Engineering drawings, inspection reports, permit letters. But this time I wasn't just flipping through them out of curiosity. I was looking for something specific. Because if Maggie Thornwell's surveyors had been right, then 12 acres of my family's land had somehow vanished into their development plans. And land doesn't just disappear, not legally. The rain kept falling outside while I sorted through the documents one by one. At first, nothing seemed unusual. County approvals from the late 70s, construction permits for the dam, letters between my grandfather and a regional office of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I reached the bottom of the stack. That's where the older papers were, faded, tipped on yellowing sheets with dates from long before I was born. One document in particular caught my eye. It was thicker than the others and folded several times like someone had carried it around for years. I opened it carefully. Across the top, in bold type, were the words, Willow Creek Watershed Senior Water Rights Deed, 1923. I'd seen it before, but I'd never really read it. Back then it had just looked like some antique paperwork Pop kept for record keeping. Now I leaned closer. The document describes something called a senior water rights claim, tied directly to the creek and surrounding watershed. According to the text, whoever owned that right controlled the flow management of Willow Creek across the entire floodplain area, which included... I stopped reading and reached for the county map Maggie had left with me. The same one showing the new property boundaries for Willowbrook Estates. I spread it out beside the deed. Then I compared the two slowly, line by line, and that's when the first real piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The subdivision wasn't just built next to Willow Creek. It was built directly inside the creek's historical flood channel, referenced in the 1923 water rights deed. My grandfather must have known that when he built the dam. That's why he had worked with federal engineers instead of just throwing up a small ranch reservoir like most landowners would have done. He wasn't just storing water. He was controlling a watershed. And suddenly the rest of the document started to make sense. The Army Corps permit, the spillway design, the flood calculations written in careful pencil across the engineering drawings. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The dam wasn't just private proper. Why record it was part of a federally recognized flood-controlled structure tied directly to Willow Creek's natural drainage system, which meant something very important. If Willowbrook Estates had built houses across the floodplain without acknowledging that structure, they hadn't just ignored my land. They had ignored federal water management law. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the map again. 35 houses, every single one sitting downstream from a reservoir capable of holding millions of gallons of water. And according to the documents spread across my table, the people who owned the dam still had legal authority over how that water moved through the valley. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. Rain continued tapping against the windows, and for the first time since Maggie Thornwell showed up at my gate, I realized something. This wasn't going to be a property dispute. It was going to be a very expensive mistake for someone who thought they understood this land better than the people who had lived on it for 70 years. The first attack didn't come in a courtroom. It came on television. I found out about it by accident. One evening I was sitting at the kitchen table going through more of my grandfather's paperwork when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend who worked at the feed store in town. "Turn on channel 7. You're on the news." That's never a good sentence to read. I grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. Just as the segment started, a smiling reporter stood in front of the Willowbrook Estates entrance sign. Behind her, one of the brand new houses gleamed under perfect evening lighting, and residents of the new Willowbrook community say they're facing a disturbing situation. She said into the camera, "A neighboring landowner is threatening to sabotage critical water infrastructure upstream." I leaned back slowly in my chair. On the screen appeared a picture of the dam on my property, except the camera angle made it look smaller than it really was, like some kind of unstable farm pond barely holding together. Then Maggie Thornwell stepped into frame. She wore the same composed expression she'd had the day she came to my gate. "Families have invested their life savings into homes here," she told the reporter. "And now we're dealing with someone who is openly talking about releasing water from a privately owned structure that hasn't been properly inspected in decades." That was interesting, because I had never said anything about releasing water. The reporter nodded sympathetically. "Are residents worried about safety?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. We're concerned the dam could fail if it isn't maintained properly. We've already contacted county officials and are urging them to investigate." I actually laughed out loud. It was a good move, I had to admit. If you can't win the argument about land ownership, change the story. Turn the quiet rancher into a reckless threat. Make it about public safety. The camera cut to interviews with a couple of homeowners standing on their manicured lawns. "We just want to feel safe," one woman said nervously. Another man pointed toward the hills behind the development. "That dam's been sitting up there for years. Nobody even knows if it's stable." I muted the television and sat there for a long moment. So that was Maggie's strategy. If she could convince the county that the dam was dangerous, they could potentially force an inspection, maybe even shut it down. And if the dam was shut down, the entire water rights argument I had discovered would suddenly get a lot weaker. I turned the sound back on just as the reporter finished the segment. "County officials say they will review the situation and determine whether further action is necessary." Of course they would. That was the whole point. 2 days later, the second attack arrived. This one came in the form of a thick envelope from the county courthouse. Inside was a legal notice. "Complaint filed Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." According to the document, the HOA was requesting an emergency injunction against me. Their claim was simple. They accused me of operating an unregulated flood control structure that posed a potential risk to nearby residential properties. They were asking the court to do 3 things. First, order an immediate engineering inspection of the dam. Second, prohibit any manual operation of the spillway gates. And third, transfer temporary control of the structure to the county until the matter was resolved. I read the last line twice. That was the real goal. If they could get the county to control the dam, they could essentially neutralize the water rights issue entirely. No dam control, no leverage. It was clever. I set the paperwork down and walked out onto the porch. The evening air was quiet except for the distant hum of construction equipment still working late in the subdivision. They were finishing the final row of houses. 35 homes now stood in the valley. Bright porch lights glowing like a small town that had appeared out of nowhere, and every one of them sat inside the same floodplain my grandfather had designed the dam to manage. 3 days later, a county inspector showed up. He arrived in a government pickup truck with a clipboard and a tired expression that suggested he had already heard about the situation from someone else. "Name's Carter," he said as he shook my hand. "Floodplain Management Office." I nodded toward the dam up the hill. "Here to inspect the dangerous structure." He sighed. "Some. Anything like that." We walked up the dirt path together while he asked routine questions. "How long has the dam been here?" "Since 1978. Any major repairs? Routine maintenance. Nothing structural." When we reached the top, he stopped and stared at the reservoir behind it. The water stretched wide across the valley, calm and still under the afternoon sun. Carter pulled a small camera from his pocket and started taking pictures. "Got permits for this thing?" he asked casually. I handed him a folder. Inside were copies of the Army Corps approvals, the construction plans, and the inspection records my grandfather had carefully kept for decades. He flipped through them slowly. Then he stopped on one page. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Where'd you get this?" The barn. He held up the document, the same one I had finally read carefully a few nights earlier. The 1923 Senior Water Rights Deed. Carter looked back at the dam, then down at the valley where Willowbrook Estate sat quietly below. "Does the HOA know about this?" he asked. I shrugged. "Hard to say." He nodded slowly, because if they built those houses without reviewing watershed control rights, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We both looked toward the subdivision. 35 homes, millions of dollars in property value, all sitting downstream from a federally permitted flood control structure tied to a century-old water management agreement. Carter closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Well," he said carefully, "this just got a lot more complicated. The plan didn't start with revenge. It started with a calendar. 3 weeks after the county inspector visited the dam, I sat at the same kitchen table where my grandfather used to spread his maps every winter and looked at something most people never think about anymore: rainfall history. The National Weather Service keeps detailed records going back decades, and Willow Creek had a pattern you could almost set your watch by. Every few years a storm system rolled down from the hills and stalled over the valley long enough to fill every drainage channel for miles. Most people saw those storms as bad luck. My grandfather had seen them as engineering data. I pulled out his old notebooks and flipped through the pages filled with careful handwriting. Every flood he had ever witnessed was recorded there. Dates, rainfall totals, how high the reservoir rose, how quickly the spillway gates had to be opened to release pressure. He hadn't built that dam blindly. He had built it with 40 years of observation behind every measurement. And right there in the margins of one notebook was a line he'd written in pencil. Asterisk, never fight water. Guide it. Astrosinctons stayed in my head while I studied the weather forecasts, because another storm system was forming in the hills. A big one. Meteorologists were predicting 3 days of steady rain across the entire watershed. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't matter much, but these weren't normal circumstances anymore. Downstream, 35 brand new homes now sat across the natural flood channel of Willow Creek. And upstream, 3 million gallons of water were waiting behind a dam the HOA had tried very hard to paint as dangerous and neglected. The irony of that accusation had been sitting quietly in my favor the entire time, because the more noise Maggie Thornwell made about the dam, the more attention the county and federal offices started paying to it. 2 days after the inspector's visit, I received a phone call from the regional office of the Army Corps of Engineers. A calm voice on the other end introduced himself as Daniel Ruiz. "We've received some inquiries about the Willow Creek flood control structure on your property," he said. "I figured you might." He chuckled softly. "Your documentation was thorough." "That was my grandfather's doing." Ruiz asked a few technical questions about maintenance, spillway operations, and reservoir capacity. I answered every one of them, using the notes and engineering drawings Pop had kept. Finally, he said something interesting. "You are aware the structure is classified as a controlled watershed release system, correct?" "Yes." "And that any emergency spillway release would need to follow federal guidelines." "I've read them." There was a short pause on the line. Then Ruiz said, "Good, because if rainfall reaches projected levels this week, the reservoir may require controlled discharge to maintain structural safety." I looked out the window toward the hills where dark clouds were already starting to gather. I was thinking the same thing. When the call ended, I felt something settle into place. For weeks, Maggie had tried to push the narrative that I was reckless, dangerous, unqualified to operate the dam. But the truth was the exact opposite. Every agency that actually understood flood control was quietly confirming the same thing. The dam wasn't a problem. Ignoring the watershed was. That evening I drove down into town and stopped at the county records office. The clerk behind the counter recognized my last name immediately. "More paperwork trouble with that new subdivision?" she asked. Something like that. I requested copies of the environmental impact reports Willowbrook Estates had filed when they received construction approval. It took her about 20 minutes to dig them out. When she handed the folder across the counter, I flipped it open right there. Hydrology analysis, soil stability surveys, drainage planning, all the things a responsible development is supposed to examine before building houses. But one thing was missing. Not one page referenced the federal flood control structure upstream. Not one page mentioned the 1923 watershed water rights, which meant one of two things had happened. Either their engineers had never checked federal water records, or someone had chosen not to include them. Neither explanation was good. I drove home under a sky that was turning darker by the hour. Wind moved through the trees along the creek, bending the tall grass in slow waves. By the time I reached the dam, the reservoir surface had already started to ripple from the approaching storm. I'd parked the truck and walked up to the control platform. The steel spillway wheels stood exactly where they had been for 45 years. Paint faded, metal worn smooth by time, but still perfectly functional. My grandfather had to bring me up here when I was a kid and explain how the gates worked. Each wheel controlled a steel plate inside the spillway channel. Turn the wheel and the gate lifted. Water flowed through the concrete chute and back into Willow Creek's natural path. Simple engineering, reliable, and completely legal when done according to the guidelines. I rested my hands on one of the wheels and looked out across the valley. Downstream, Willowbrook Estates glowed with porch lights and street lamps. Families were probably eating dinner, watching television, living their lives in houses built on land they believed was perfectly safe. None of them had ever seen Willow Creek during a real watershed release. Most people assume disasters happen suddenly, but real ones rarely do. Vast disasters start with a long chain of small decisions. Ignoring a floodplain, skipping a federal permit check, trusting a glossy development plan instead of the land itself. By midnight, the rain had started. Not a violent storm, just a steady curtain of water falling across the hills. The kind my grandfather used to watch from the porch with a cup of coffee, quietly calculating how long it would take the reservoir to rise. I stayed up most of the night, reviewing the flood control procedures one last time. Not because I didn't understand them, but because I wanted everything documented, every measurement, every rainfall report, every reservoir level. If the spillway gates had to open, they would open for exactly one reason. The same reason they had been built in the first place, to let Willow Creek go where it had always gone. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It started as a quiet drizzle, the kind that taps softly on the roof and lulls most people to sleep. But by the second night, it had turned into something heavier, steady, relentless, like the sky had decided to tie itself over the entire valley. By the morning of the third day, Willow Creek wasn't a creek anymore. It was a rising force of nature. I stood on the dam platform before sunrise, rain soaking through my jacket, staring at the reservoir gauge bolted into the concrete wall. The red marker had already climbed higher than it had in almost 20 years. The water surface behind the dam looked calm, but calm water can lie. Beneath that glassy surface, millions of gallons were pressing forward, building pressure the dam had been designed to manage, but only if someone actually operated it. My grandfather used to say that dams don't fail because of water. They fail because people hesitate. I checked the gauge again. Another inch higher, then another inch higher, then another. By 8 in the morning, my phone was buzzing with alerts. The National Weather Service had issued a watershed flood advisory for the entire region. Creeks were swelling everywhere. Down in Willowbrook Estates, the HOA board was probably sipping coffee in their expensive kitchens, still convinced they had beaten me. Still convinced the land belonged to them. Now, what they didn't understand was that land remembers, and water remembers even better. Around mid-morning, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road leading to the dam. I recognized the county logo on the door before the engine even stopped. Two men stepped out. One of them was Daniel Ruiz from the Army Corps of Engineers. The other was the same county inspector who had visited weeks earlier. Ruiz walked up beside me and looked out over the reservoir. "Higher than expected," he said. "Storms stalled over the hills," I replied. The inspector checked the gauge and whistled under his breath. 3 million gallons pushing against that wall. Ruiz nodded slowly. "You've been logging levels?" I handed him the waterproof notebook. Their measurement was written down. Every hour, every rainfall report. He flipped through the pages for a minute, then closed it and handed it back. "You've done exactly what the federal guidelines require." I didn't say anything. He looked downstream toward Willowbrook Estates. Even from the dam you could see the rooftops of the new homes scattered across the valley floor. 35 houses, 35 expensive mistakes. 35 expensive mistakes. Ruiz exhaled slowly. "If the reservoir climbs another 6 inches, we'll need a controlled spillway release." The inspector looked uneasy. "Won't that flood the downstream channel?" Ruiz didn't hesitate. "It will return the water to its natural path." Natural path. The exact phrase my grandfather used to write in his notebooks. By noon, the reservoir had climbed 4 more inches. The rain hadn't slowed. Dark clouds rolled over the hills like waves, and every drainage gully feeding Willow Creek was pouring water into the reservoir. Ruiz checked the gauge again. 2 inches left. I looked down at the steel spillway wheel beside us. 45 years of rusted paint, but still solid. Still waiting. For a moment everything was quiet except for the rain. Then the inspector's radio crackled. Reports of standing water in Willowbrook Estates. Storm drains overwhelmed. Ruiz looked toward the valley again. That development never accounted for watershed flow. "No," I said. They didn't. Another inch climbed on the gauge. Then another. Ruiz turned to me. "All right, we're at threshold." He pointed to the spillway wheel. "Controlled release. Quarter gate to start." I stepped forward and wrapped both hands around the metal wheel. For a second, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice behind me. "Never fight water. Guide it." The wheel resisted at first. Then it groaned and began to turn. Deep inside, the concrete struck her. Sure, the steel spillway gates slowly lifted. At first, nothing happened. Then a low rumble echoed through the dam. Water began rushing into the spillway chute. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, like distant thunder rolling through a canyon. Ruiz checked the gauge again. Perfect. Pressure stabilizing. Downstream, Willow Creek came back to life. The water shot through the concrete spillway and surged into the natural channel that had existed long before anyone dreamed of building Willowbrook Estates. The channel curved through the valley, straight through the center of the subdivision. From the dam platform, we could see it happening. At first, it looked like a harmless stream weaving through the grass. Then the volume increased. Brown floodwater spread across the old floodplain, exactly the way it had for centuries. Toward the houses, sirens began echoing from the valley below. Emergency vehicles raced through the neighborhood streets. People came outside onto porches, staring in disbelief as water poured across yards that developers had promised would never flood. One house lost its driveway first. Then another backyard disappeared beneath muddy water. The spillway kept roaring behind us, releasing the pressure the dam had safely held for decades. Ruiz watched the valley through binoculars. "They built right across the channel," he said quietly. I nodded. They did. More water rushed through Willow Creek. Not uncontrolled. Not destructive. Just following the land the way nature had always intended. By late afternoon, news vans were arriving at the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. Cameras filmed streets, turning into shallow rivers. Homeowners argued with HOA representatives in soaked raincoats. And somewhere in the chaos, Maggie Thornwell stood watching the same water she had insisted was never a threat. The controlled release continued for 3 hours. By sunset, the reservoir gauge finally began to drop. The storm was weakening. The hills had emptied most of their runoff. Ruiz signaled for me to close the gate halfway. The roar softened. Willow Creek settled back into its channel, though half the subdivision was still knee-deep in muddy water. Emergency crews worked through the evening helping residents evacuate flooded homes. None of the damage had come from the dam. It came from building houses where a creek had always flowed. As the sky darkened, Ruiz packed up his gear. "You handled that exactly by the book," he said. "Federal compliance, documented levels, controlled discharge." He glanced toward the valley one last time. "That development is going to face some serious investigations." The county inspector looked pale. "They never filed watershed permits." Ruiz nodded. "Then they never should have built there." Their SUV disappeared down the dirt road. I stayed on the dam platform for a while longer, watching the last light fade over the hills. The reservoir was calm again. The spillway gate sat half-closed, and far down in the valley, the lights of Willowbrook Estates flickered across streets still covered in muddy water. 35 houses, built on land that had never belonged to them. For weeks, the HOA had tried to bully me, threaten me, paint me as the villain. But in the end, I didn't die. Have to fight them. I didn't have to destroy anything. All I had to do was open the dam and let the water remember where it was always meant to go.